The story of Fatima and the Jinn, Buddhist teachings. Fatima is a young girl living in a small village, where every day she and her mother sell flowers and prayer beads at a famous temple. This work helps them make ends meet, and although they are poor, they are always surrounded by love and respect for each other. Every evening, after the sun sets, Fatima carefully packs up the goods and prepares to go home. She always works hard, trying to return before nightfall. These habits have been ingrained in her mind since childhood, and her mother's words always echo in her head, "Come home before it gets dark, my child." One day, as the sun slowly sets and night begins to envelop the area around the temple, Fatima is hurriedly packing up to leave. But when she turns to leave, a strange figure appears before her. A young man, handsome in appearance, stands right at the temple door, his eyes shining as if he has been waiting for her for a long time. Fatima is slightly surprised and a bit frightened, but after a moment's hesitation, she regains her composure and speaks up. "The temple is closed. What are you doing here at this hour? It's late." The young man doesn't answer immediately but smiles gently. He then steps toward her and replies, "This is the time I usually come to the temple. It's only at this hour that I can offer my prayers. At this hour, I can truly feel peace in my heart." His answer strikes Fatima as odd. She had never seen him here at this hour before. Suddenly, her confusion causes her to lose her calm. The young man continues, "I want to buy some flowers. Can you sell me some?" Fatima looks around, but there are only a few leftover flowers, the ones that hadn't been sold during the day. Not wanting to refuse rudely, she tries to be polite. "My flowers are all gone. I have nothing left to sell today." The young man looks at her for a moment without saying anything, then steps over to her stall where only a few fallen flowers remain on the ground. He bends down, picks them up, and looks back at her, offering a gentle smile. "Still, I want to give you a gift. This is my money, but you don't have to accept it if you don't want to." Fatima hesitates for a moment but quickly declines. "I can't accept your money. I'm just a flower seller, I don't need gifts like this." With a slight nod, the young man smiles once more, then turns and walks away. Fatima breathes a sigh of relief, thinking that this strange encounter was just a coincidence. But as she walks along the road to her home, a strange feeling begins to creep over her. It's as if someone is following her, making her uneasy. Her heart beats faster as she hears the faint sound of footsteps behind her. She turns around, but there is no one there. An indescribable feeling of restlessness fills her heart. Suddenly, from the darkness, a voice gently yet urgently calls out, "Adjust your headscarf, child." The voice startles her, and she stops in her tracks. For some reason, those words feel like an order from someone, and she instinctively reaches up to adjust her headscarf, hurriedly fixing it. But when she looks around, no one is there. Suddenly, a vague sense of fear rises within her. Who said those words? And why now? Fatima quickly picks up her pace, hurrying home. With each step, it feels as if someone is following her, with soft breaths and shadowy figures glimpsed behind her, as if invisible beings are watching her every move. Sweat begins to bead on her forehead, and she feels a chilling sensation enveloping her, even though there is no wind and no obvious reason for it. Finally, she reaches home and hastily knocks on the door. Her mother, who has always taught her lessons of humility and faith in God, opens the door and sees the terrified expression on her daughter's face. "Fatima, what's wrong? Why are you so frightened?" Fatima only shakes her head, unable to speak. She doesn't want her mother to worry, but her heart is racing. She sighs, trying to calm herself. "Mother, you always told me to come home before it gets dark, right? I came home, and nothing happened." Her mother says nothing further, just sighs and closes the door, but in her heart, she too is troubled. Fatima, exhausted, lies down on her bed, but the memories of the mysterious young man and the strange voice won't leave her. She tries to close her eyes but cannot sleep. That night, she has a strange dream. In the dream, she sees a blurry face, with eyes full of anger and power. A voice echoes in the dark. "Don't let your headscarf fall. From now on, you must always remember what I told you." Fatima jolts awake, her heart racing. And before she can fully comprehend what is happening, a familiar sound rings out from afar, the muezzin's call to prayer. She breathes a sigh of relief, feeling slightly comforted, but the nameless fear still lingers deep inside her. The next morning, as the sunlight filtered through the window cracks, Fatima woke up with a vague feeling, as if she had just gone through a nightmare, yet could not quite remember it clearly. She hurriedly stood up and began preparing for a new workday, but her mind couldn't escape the image of the strange young man and the peculiar voice she had heard the previous night. The feeling of fear and unease wouldn't leave her. She looked into the mirror, and for the first time, she noticed that her headscarf, which she had always worn securely, now seemed loose, as if some invisible change had affected it. She tried to push those thoughts aside, but couldn't. Breakfast passed quietly, with her mother, as usual, paying attention to every dish, caring for her with all the love in the world. But Fatima felt she could not share her worries with her mother. Her mother would never understand the strange things she was going through. She could only keep everything inside and continue with life as normal. When she arrived at the temple to continue her work selling flowers and prayer beads, there was something different in the air today. Though the sky remained bright, the surrounding atmosphere seemed heavy with an unclear sense of anxiety. The familiar faces, the usual customers, were not there as much as usual. It seemed as though everything around her had become quiet, solemn, as if something had changed in the space that she couldn't quite comprehend. Suddenly, as she was arranging the flowers on her stall, she saw the familiar figure of the young man from yesterday approaching. She turned her face away, trying not to look at him, but the young man didn't appear unfamiliar. He stepped closer and looked directly into Fatima's eyes with a gentle smile. "Do you have flowers today?" the young man asked. Fatima was startled but couldn't help but respond. "I don't have anything to sell today. Everything was sold out early." The young man didn't react but only smiled strangely, as if he had already known this answer. He stepped closer to the flower stall and gazed intently at the empty baskets. "This time, I can help you," he said gently. Fatima didn't understand, standing still, feeling as though she were hypnotized by the young man's gaze. Suddenly, all the baskets of flowers she thought had been sold were neatly arranged in front of her, as if they had never been purchased. A chill ran down her spine, and she felt as though something supernatural was happening. She couldn't explain it, but she could clearly feel that this was not normal. How could you do this?" Fatima asked, her voice trembling. The young man only smiled and replied, "Don't worry, I just want to help you." Fatima couldn't say anything more. His words had a compelling power, as if each word he spoke had an irresistible urge that made it impossible for her to resist. She looked around, but no one else seemed to notice the strange things happening before her. The people passing by continued with their lives, oblivious to the presence of the young man. After receiving the restored flowers, the young man said something strange. "Don't worry about what's happening in your life, Fatima. Everything has a reason." The young man turned, walking away confidently, leaving Fatima standing, stunned, in confusion. How did he know her name? How could he know things only she understood? She couldn't make sense of it, but the tension inside her only grew stronger. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. When she returned home, a strange and fearful feeling followed her. Throughout the afternoon, she couldn't focus on anything. Every sound, every glance, made her feel as though someone was watching her from the shadows. She felt an intense unease, as though something dangerous was waiting for her, and she couldn't escape it. The young man's words kept echoing in her mind. "Don't worry, everything will become clear. Everything has a reason." Those words felt like a warning, causing her heart to race. She had a sense that she was being drawn into a world she couldn't control, and she didn't know how to escape. That night, as she was preparing to sleep, a strange voice again echoed in the dark room. The voice did not come from anyone in her family, but it seemed to come from inside her own head. "Don't worry, Fatima. I will always be with you. Everything will be clear soon." Fatima quickly opened her eyes, but there was no one in the room. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. But she couldn't deny that something was changing, and it had to do with the mysterious young man she had met. The next morning, the weak sunlight filtered through the small window frame, casting light into Fatima's room, waking her from a long night full of strange dreams. The images of the young man Jafran and the mysterious voices still echoed in her mind. She couldn't forget his gaze, his strange confidence, and especially the words he had spoken, as if he knew everything about her life, secrets she had never shared with anyone. Still, she tried to keep herself calm, as if everything was just a dream, a temporary nightmare that would eventually pass. But the truth was, she felt an unusual connection to him, something that couldn't be explained by logic, but could only be felt with the heart. She began working as usual, selling flowers and prayer beads at the temple. However, the atmosphere today was still different from any other day. Her footsteps on the way to the temple seemed heavier, as though there was an invisible force pulling her back, a strength she couldn't resist. The feeling of unease surged in her heart, and every time she turned her head, she felt as if someone was watching her. Although there was no one around, her heart could not calm down. When she arrived at the temple, everything seemed still and quiet. There was no one standing at the temple's door as usual, and no familiar customers. The surroundings felt cold and desolate, as if something was shrouding the space. Fatima felt uneasy, but she forced a smile at the early customers and continued her work as if nothing had happened. Suddenly, in the midst of that stillness, she heard a familiar voice from behind. It was him, the young man Jafran, still standing there, but this time he wasn't just watching, he moved towards her with a serious and somewhat hurried expression. Fatima jumped, once again unable to understand why he always appeared at just the right moment, as if he knew she would be there. "Aren't you worried, Fatima?" Jafran's voice rang out, full of seriousness. Fatima stood still, unable to respond. She wanted to say something, but couldn't. His words felt like an order from some powerful force, something beyond anything she could comprehend. Who are you?" she stammered, trying to regain her composure. Jafran looked at her with a deep gaze, as if he knew everything inside her, every thought she hadn't dared to express. He smiled gently, but that smile carried an indescribable sadness, as though he was enduring something he couldn't change. I am the one who will always be with you, Fatima. Whether you want it or not, we have a connection, Jaffran said, his voice pouring into her ears. She shook her head, trying to understand what he had just said. How could that be? How could someone like him be with her for life, without her choice? Fatima couldn't understand. She only felt the tension and anxiety in her heart growing stronger. You can't force me, she whispered, her eyes filling with tears, the feeling of helplessness overwhelming her. Jaffran looked at her for a moment, and the seriousness in his eyes changed. He stepped closer to her, speaking softly. Don't be afraid, Fatima. I don't want to scare you. I just want to help you see the path you must follow. I will always be here, protecting you. His words were like an eternal promise, but Fatima felt as if she were trapped in a world she couldn't control. Everything Jaffran said had a strange truth, something inexplicable, as if an invisible force was pulling her towards him. All of her emotions and thoughts quieted down. There were no sounds, no images, only Jaffran's words. Suddenly, a small noise from the temple door snapped her back to reality. She turned around and saw a group of customers entering the temple. Strangely, they didn't see anything, didn't notice Jaffran's strange presence. Everything seemed to return to normal, but Fatima knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Jaffran stood up, smiling at her, and before he left, he spoke one last sentence. Remember, Fatima, I will always be with you. When you need me, just call my name. His words felt like a curse, like a fate that she couldn't change. Fatima stood there, watching him disappear, her heart filled with emotions she couldn't express. She didn't know what to do, didn't know where the path ahead would lead, but one thing was certain, her life could never return to what it was before. As the customers began buying flowers from her, Fatima's mind still spun with thoughts of Jaffran and the things he had said. How could she escape his control? How could she live in a world where everything seemed preordained? If you're still watching this video and want to help Fatima find peace, please comment the number 5 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you do so and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our videos. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. Fatima returned to the temple the next morning, but her mood was completely different. She felt as if she were living in a dream she couldn't wake up from, a nightmare with no escape. Everything around her seemed hazy, as though she were walking in a parallel world, where the rules she had once known no longer applied. Jaffran, with his mysterious words and power, had made it impossible for her to escape the feeling of unease and fear. When she arrived at the temple, a strange sensation enveloped the space. Although a new day had come, everything still felt different. The customers no longer came to the temple as they did before, and there were no friendly gazes or greetings. Everything had become silent and cold, as if time had stopped. Fatima could clearly feel that everything had changed, and that change was connected to Jaffran's presence. She still didn't understand why he had appeared in her life, why he claimed that she and he had an inseparable connection. But one thing she couldn't deny was that she couldn't stop thinking about him. The strange feeling of this connection, even if from a supernatural world, continued to haunt her. She couldn't stop wondering whether his words were really true, whether she could resist that control. Amid her chaotic thoughts, she suddenly heard a familiar voice. You don't need to worry, Fatima. I won't scare you anymore. Fatima jumped and turned around, seeing Jaffran standing there, right in front of her. Although no one else was around, it felt as though he had always been here, as if he had been watching her for a long time. Once again, she felt his gaze like an arrow piercing her mind, touching the darkest corners of her heart. "It's you again. Why do you keep watching me? Why do you always appear in my life?" Fatima said, her voice trembling, but she tried to remain calm. Jaffran didn't respond immediately. He just stood and looked at her, his gaze filled with empathy but also power, as though he could see through all her thoughts, all the emotions she had never dared to reveal. Finally, he smiled gently and replied, "Fatima, you don't need to understand everything right now. This is just the beginning of a journey you cannot avoid. I will always be with you, protecting you, whenever you need me." His words felt like a curse, like a promise that she couldn't refuse. Fatima didn't understand why she felt this way, but she knew that everything was not just a mere coincidence. Since the moment she met Jaffran, her life had changed forever, and now, she couldn't escape this pull. "I don't want this connection with you. I can't live under the influence of a jinn," Fatima said with determination. Jaffran looked at her, his eyes sparkling as if with eternal wisdom. He didn't react immediately, but there was a strange patience in his eyes, as if he knew she wouldn't be able to resist forever. "You don't need to be afraid. I'm not an evil jinn. You've already felt that, haven't you? We're not enemies, Fatima. I don't want to harm you," he said in a soft yet firm tone. Fatima looked at him, her heart racing. She couldn't understand everything. A part of her wanted to run away, to get as far from him as possible, but another part felt some force pulling her closer to him. His words, though sweet, also carried an obsession, as if she couldn't fight against them. "Then, if you're not an evil jinn, why do you keep appearing in my life? Why can't I live in peace?" Fatima asked, her voice full of confusion. Jaffran stepped closer to her, the distance between them closing naturally, as if they had always belonged together. He spoke gently. "You can't live in peace as long as there's still suffering in your heart, Fatima. I'm here to help you find peace within yourself. Since you called my name, I've felt your pain, your loneliness, your fear. I'm here to help you overcome all of it." His words felt like a test, a challenge to her resilience. Fatima looked at him, unsure of what to do, uncertain whether she should trust his words. But she couldn't deny that since Jaffran's appearance, strange feelings and a sense of peace she had never known before had begun to stir within her. Jaffran didn't wait for her to respond, but simply smiled gently, as if everything had already been predetermined. He turned and walked away, leaving Fatima standing in silence. But before he left, he stopped and said one final sentence. "When you truly need me, just call my name. I will always be with you." The next day, Fatima felt a strange sensation enveloping her life. Everything around her seemed unchanged. The temple was still silent, the flowers still the same, but in her heart, nothing was as it had been before. The connection with Jaffran, even though from a supernatural world, now felt like an invisible thread binding her, making it impossible for her to break free. His words still echoed in her mind, "When you truly need me, just call my name. I will always be with you." She couldn't deny the truth that, whether she wanted to or not, Jaffran had become a part of her life. The moments of peace he brought to her soul could not be denied either. Every time she felt fear or anxiety, his image would appear in her mind, like a comfort, a promise that could not be broken. Fatima didn't know what to do next. She wanted to live a normal life, free from the strange and supernatural forces. But every decision she made seemed to be influenced by Jaffran. She couldn't avoid it forever. Everything had changed, and now, she had to face the truth. One morning, while standing by the flower stall, she once again saw Jaffran appear before her. He stepped closer to her, but this time there was a seriousness in his gaze, no longer the mystery or teasing like before. Fatima felt her heart race as she saw him. She knew that today would be an unavoidable confrontation. "Fatima, you don't need to be afraid anymore," Jaffran said, his voice serious, filled with weight. "I will not force you to do anything you don't want to. But you must understand that the connection between us is unchangeable. You will never be alone again." She stood still, staring at him, but her heart couldn't decide. She felt like she was trapped between two worlds. One was the normal life she had known, the other was the strange world Jaffran brought. She knew that if she accepted this connection, she would never be able to go back to the way things were. She would have to face challenges, dangers she couldn't foresee. "I can't live in fear, Jaffran," she replied, her voice firm, but her heart filled with confusion. "I can't be bound by a relationship like this. I want my own freedom." Jaffran said nothing, just gazing at her for a long moment, his eyes seeming to carry understanding. After a long silence, he spoke gently. "You can choose not to be with me, Fatima. But you cannot escape your destiny. Destiny chose you long ago. And when you truly need help, I will always be here." He turned to leave, but before disappearing, he paused once more, his eyes fixed on Fatima. "You will need me, Fatima. Whether you want to or not. But when that time comes, don't hesitate." Fatima stood still, feeling as though everything around her had suddenly become blurred. She couldn't understand this strange connection, but one thing was certain, her life would never be the same again. The bond with Jaffran, in whatever form it took, had become too deep and could not be erased. She began to reflect on the things that had happened, the strange events in her life since Jaffran's arrival. She couldn't deny that he had helped her through difficult moments, protected her from things she couldn't explain. But was it really protection, or just manipulation of her mind? Fatima decided she could no longer let her life be entirely controlled by an invisible force. She had to do something to regain her freedom. But she also knew that whenever she called Jaffran's name, he would always be there. This made it impossible for her to make a definitive decision. She felt trapped in an internal struggle with no end in sight. One day, while praying in her room, a strange feeling once again enveloped her soul. It felt as though some force was pressing down on her heart. A voice spoke, but it wasn't Jaffran's voice, it was another voice, gentler and calmer. "Fatima, you don't need to be afraid. Trust your heart. Peace will come to you when you learn to open yourself." This voice, though gentle, was powerful, making Fatima pause in her thoughts. She couldn't explain this feeling, but one thing was certain, she needed to listen to her heart more than ever before. She had always sought peace in Jaffran's words, but could true peace be found within that connection? She decided she would no longer let Jaffran's words control her. She had to take charge of her own life. No matter how afraid she was, no matter how confused, Fatima had to face her decision. She would find her own path, a path to freedom and peace within her soul, without relying on anyone else. Fatima was determined not to let herself be drawn into Jaffran's control any longer. Although her heart was still full of doubts and fears, she knew that if she didn't make a decision, her life would forever be bound to a relationship she didn't want. Everything strange and supernatural had a reason, but she felt that true freedom and peace of mind could only come when she truly took control of her own life. In the days that followed, Fatima spent more time in quiet prayer, seeking peace in her soul. She no longer went to the temple every day as she had before. Instead, she found peaceful places where she could face herself and reflect on the things that had happened. Each time she prayed, it felt as though she was receiving guidance from an invisible source, not from Jaffran, but from a higher power. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace as she let go of worries and fears. Fatima's mother noticed the change in her daughter. She no longer seemed panicked when Jaffran appeared, and her demeanor became calmer and more peaceful. Her mother began to worry because she didn't understand the reason for this change, but she didn't want to disturb Fatima. She just silently watched her daughter with a look full of concern but also love. One day, while Fatima was sitting in her quiet room, praying, she felt a cold breeze sweep across her. She stood up startled, but it wasn't Jaffran. It was another presence. A vague image appeared in her mind, and this time, instead of fear, she felt a strange peace. The voice she heard was not Jaffran's, but that of a saint, someone who had entered her life through dreams. Fatima, you have found your path. Don't be afraid, you will never be alone. Your prayers have been heard, and now is the time for you to stand firm. She looked up, clearly feeling a special connection, a comfort she had never experienced. She couldn't explain the feeling, but she knew that this was the help she had been waiting for. This sense of peace made Fatima realize that life was not always easy, and sometimes, we must face great challenges to find true freedom. Jaffran's appearance might have been a part of her lesson, but it was not the end of the story. She needed to be strong, to face everything, not just Jaffran, but herself. One evening, as she was returning home from the temple, she saw Jaffran standing there, waiting for her as usual. This time, he wasn't smiling mysteriously as he had before, but instead had a serious and expectant expression. Fatima felt something different in the air, and in her heart, thoughts about this relationship swirled. You have found peace in your heart, haven't you, Fatima? Jaffran asked, his voice gentle, yet still powerful. Fatima didn't respond immediately. She just stood still, looking at him, feeling the changes within herself. She was no longer afraid. She knew that, whether Jaffran was a jinn or some supernatural force, he could no longer control her life. She was the one who would decide her life, and she wouldn't let anyone else decide for her. I have found peace in my soul, Jaffran. I no longer need your protection, Fatima said, her voice firm, no longer trembling with fear. Jaffran looked at her silently, his gaze no longer as hard as before, but softened. He understood that Fatima's journey was no longer one he was guiding. This girl had grown, she had found her own path. I don't want to keep you. If you want to go, you can go, Jaffran said, his voice gentle, but full of acceptance. Fatima looked at him one last time, then turned and walked away. She no longer felt fear, only freedom and peace. Her steps were steady, and she felt clearly that she was no longer weak, no longer easily swayed by invisible forces. She had taken control of her own life. When she looked back one final time, Jaffran had disappeared, as though he had never existed in her life. But Fatima knew that his appearance had been only a part of her long journey. A part she had passed through to find freedom in her soul. If you're still watching this video and find the story meaningful, please comment number 9 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend you do so and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any of our videos. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. After Jaffran's sudden disappearance, Fatima felt a strange serenity wash over her soul. Her life returned to normal, but this time, it was different. She no longer felt controlled by his appearance or the supernatural connections he had brought. She was free, peaceful, and more grounded than ever. Every step she took in life now was without anxiety or fear, but with a strong belief in herself. She returned to her work selling flowers, but this time, everything felt different. The customers who came to her didn't just buy flowers, they came to feel the peace, the freshness that she had found in her life. Her flowers were no longer just decorations, they became gifts that brought hope, joy, and comfort to those who came to her. Fatima realized that it was in the stillness of her heart that she could help others, showing them that even though life might be full of challenges, peace and faith in oneself could help overcome all hardships. Her mother noticed the clear change in Fatima. She no longer seemed confused or anxious about the future, but instead, she had become more mature and confident. Every morning, when Fatima went outside, her mother looked at her daughter with satisfaction and pride. Though she didn't understand everything that had happened in Fatima's life, she sensed that her daughter had truly grown. And that was all she needed. Fatima continued to live in peace and tranquility, no longer haunted by strange figures or unexplained voices. The nights she prayed still passed, but this time, she felt clearly that all her prayers were being heard, without needing any supernatural force. Fatima had learned to trust in herself, in the inner strength she always had, and knew that only with determination and faith in God could she overcome all challenges in life. One day, as she was walking along the familiar road to the temple, she felt an indescribable serenity. Her heart no longer felt heavy as it once did. Instead, it was filled with joy and hope. The weary days had passed, and now, she had found herself. She no longer feared the things that couldn't be explained, but instead, she saw all those things as a part of her journey. When she entered the temple, she no longer saw Jafran's shadow or felt the unease she once did. She felt the presence of something higher, but it wasn't fear or threat. It was a gentle, peaceful presence, as if God was watching over her, protecting her, helping her continue her path. Fatima no longer sought someone to rely on. She had learned that true freedom and peace could only be found within herself. She didn't need to depend on any force or person. Through her trials and sacrifices, she had found her own path. Every day that passed, she felt stronger, more confident. The lessons life had brought her helped her realize that every challenge had a reason, and suffering was not an end but a stepping stone for us to find freedom. Fatima had found peace in her soul, not through the appearance of a jinn or some supernatural force, but through her own strength and belief in herself. One afternoon, while tending to her small flower garden, a woman approached, her gaze curious and full of wonder. She looked at Fatima for a while before speaking. "You're the flower seller at the temple, aren't you? I've heard about you, about how you've changed and become the person you are today." Fatima looked at her, not surprised. Stories about her had begun to spread throughout the village. She smiled and nodded. "Yes, I'm the flower seller. But I don't just sell flowers. I sell hope, joy, and peace," Fatima replied, her voice gentle, but full of confidence. The woman smiled, and her gaze softened, as if Fatima had shared something important. She sat down beside Fatima, and in the quiet space, both of them didn't need to say anything else. Fatima understood that what she had gone through was not only her journey but everyone's journey, a journey to find peace, to find freedom in the soul. Fatima was no longer the anxious and fearful girl she had once been. She had overcome great challenges in her life and learned that true peace and freedom do not come from the outside, but from within her own heart. After intense experiences, she found freedom in her soul, no longer bound by any forces, no longer afraid or worried about things she couldn't explain. She understood that peace comes from steadfastness and belief in oneself. In the days that followed, her life returned to tranquility. Fatima continued her work selling flowers, but this time, her work was not just for a living, it became a part of her journey to share her peace with others. She no longer just sold flowers, she offered hope, freshness, and comfort to those who came to her. She became an inspiration to those who struggled with anxiety and fear, just as she had once done. One day, she received an invitation from a family in the village, inviting her to participate in a sharing session about life and the lessons she had learned. They had heard about the changes in her and felt that she could be a source of encouragement for the community. Fatima accepted the invitation without hesitation and participated in the session, where she stood before the crowd and shared her journey. She spoke about the challenges she had faced, the days of living in anxiety and fear, and how she had found peace in her soul. She said that peace doesn't come from external things, but from trust in oneself. Her words made the crowd fall silent for a moment, and then they applauded, a gesture of encouragement and appreciation for what Fatima had overcome. After the session, a woman approached her, her eyes filled with emotion. "Thank you, Fatima. What you shared today helped me realize that I too can overcome the difficulties in my life." Fatima smiled, feeling happiness in knowing that what she had gone through wasn't just her journey but could also be an inspiration for others. She understood that life is not only about living for oneself but also about sharing the lessons and experiences one has learned. From that moment on, Fatima's words began to spread throughout the community. She received many invitations to participate in sharing sessions, not just in the village but from surrounding areas as well. She no longer felt lonely or afraid. Instead, she felt a deep joy when she saw those around her finding inspiration and comfort in her words. However, Fatima never forgot that even though she had found peace, the journey wasn't over. Life would always bring new challenges, but she knew she was ready to face them. She had learned that, no matter what difficulties arise, determination and self-belief are the keys to overcoming them. One afternoon, as she sat by the window, looking out, she clearly felt that the journey of seeking peace was not just a personal path, but part of the journey of all those who are seeking freedom in their souls. Everyone can find peace and self-belief if they dare to face themselves and overcome life's challenges. She smiled, realizing that no matter how many challenges life might bring, she had found true freedom in her soul. And with that belief, she continued on her path, no longer fearful, no longer anxious, but filled with resilience and love. She knew that, no matter what happened, she would always maintain her belief in herself and in the beautiful values life had taught her. And that is the end of Fatima's journey of seeking peace and freedom, a journey not just of overcoming challenges, but also of finding herself and sharing valuable lessons with others. Today, as you look back on Fatima's story, ask yourself, are you feeling bound by anxiety, fear, or negative emotions? Are you willing to forgive yourself and others, to open your heart and find peace? Remember, freedom doesn't come from external circumstances, but from liberation within the soul. Fatima's lesson serves as a reminder for all of us that, no matter how challenging life may be, peace and freedom are always within our own power. Through perseverance, forgiveness, and an open heart, we can find the path to liberation. Thank you for joining us today. We'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment below and share one thing you've learned today, along with how you plan to apply it in your life. Your thoughts are very important to us, so don't hesitate to share them. Reading your comments gives us motivation and wonderful encouragement. If you liked this video and found it helpful, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video to support us. This helps us continue creating great content to inform and inspire you. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to meeting you in the next video. Continue walking with us on the path of learning and discovering deeper life lessons.